Thank you again for being here. When we established the theme of coming home or welcome home for our Sunday this week, my immediate thoughts were one of the great chapters of Scripture. I'm going to read it to you this morning because it is the theme. And I want to preface it by saying one other thing, that last week when Randy and I were in Arizona to watch the Vikings find yet another reason or way to lose, or maybe it's a familiar one. Maybe that was what it was. My good friend and his wife, we're very good friends, and got into a little theological debate down there, as is sometimes the case. And it also has led me to a word that I want to share with you this morning. And I'll explain that in a bit. But here is one of the great chapters of Scripture. I must begin with, as my little note there says, chapter 14, verse 34, and then I'm going to read you chapter 15 of Luke's Gospel. This is how chapter 14 ends. It is fit neither for the soil nor for the manure. They throw it away. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. And now 15. Now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near to listen to him. And the Pharisees and the scribes were grumbling. You know, they're the religious leaders of the time. This fellow welcomes sinners and eats with them. So he told them this parable. These are parables that you have heard. Which of you, having 100 sheep and losing one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders and rejoices. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." Just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven, or as Lynn wants to say, home, over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. Or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? When she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors and says, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost." Just so I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me." So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had, traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough and to spare, but here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, quickly, bring out the robe, the best one, put it on him, put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Get the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. The son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now the elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked, what is going on? He replied, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound. Then he became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him. But he answered his father, listen, for all these years, I've been working like a slave for you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him? Then the father said to him, son, you are always with me, and always all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead, has come back to life. He was lost and has been found. He has come home. A few years ago, the elder board of our church began to have significant discussions around the creation of a strategic plan that would help guide our church over the coming years. We were just in the front stages of doing some of that important work when COVID hit and everything kind of got a little derailed, and I had to kind of shift a little bit. But you know, that slideshow told you we didn't stop, we didn't quit, did we? And I am proud of this church. But I want to just quickly remind you of these initiatives that we adopted as a church after the elder board created them. And the elder board created them in discussion with the staff. It was not the staff had one vision, the elder board had a different vision. We worked together as the elder board and the staff and created these 5 important areas that we were going to focus on since about 2 years ago or a year ago. And one of them was, how are we going to do discipleship in a pandemic? And now we're asking, how are we going to do discipleship in a, can't really say post-pandemic, can we? But in an emerging, ever-changing dynamic of being in church, and it's so good to see you, and yet still having to wear masks and not run around and hug each other. And how are we going to still get together in meaningful ways to understand and demystify this idea of discipleship? How are we going to build a culture that Calvary is defined by? We are a cultured church, and what is core to our culture is that we, as we sang the song today, desire to be more and more like Jesus. That's what discipleship is. The growing, and part of that is desire. I've talked about these words with you over the course of the summer, and I'm going to add one to your list today. And in my way of wanting to be a poet, not a very good one, I grant you that. But again, each of these words or these ideas begin with the letter D. I talked about departure. I've talked about desire. I've talked about descent and ascent. I've talked about development of your own voice. And last time I talked about a deep dive into understanding yourself. And you remember I mentioned the old native tale about the 2 wolves. Discipleship is feeding the wolf in you that will lead you to life. And we have another wolf, greed and hypocrisy and anger and envy and sin and all of that. And that will destroy our lives. We know that. We see it. We see it in individuals' lives. We see it in structures. We see it around the world. So discipleship is taking a deep dive into knowing yourself, and feeding the part in you that is of God. And this morning, I want to add this word, the word decision. Now, in one way, it could be, you could think of it as a decision like a Billy Graham altar call decision. When I was 16 years old, I was at a church. My family didn't go to church, as most of you know. It was an altar call preacher. I knew that there would be an altar call. I made a decision in my life that I was going to go up. On that particular Sunday, I was the only one. I remember my knees were shaking. It was a very much a big sanctuary like this, but it had a lot more people. And there I was standing, being invited to give my life to God as I understood God at that time, to make a decision for Jesus Christ, to make him my personal Lord and Savior. A decision. Of course, that decision that changed the trajectory of my life. Another important decision, and this is the decision that I got into a little bit of a debate about in Arizona, I think was fundamentally around this, is I think you and I have to decide, and it's a little bit like finding your own voice. You and I have to decide what is really the core character of God. When you strip it all away, all the theology, all the debates, all the centuries, all the fractions in the church, all the branches, in you, who is God? The core character that defines the Creator. Because it's who you worship. You understand? Of course, I'm very well aware of the fact that one of the great temptations is to create God in our own image. God is like me. That's why I chose Luke 15. Not only because of the welcome home theme, but because I think in these three parables is an incredibly clear statement about the core character of God. So, this is a quote from Brennan Manning, and I'll just read it so that everybody has it on the recording. What comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us, A.W. Tozer said. Talking about how people project their opinions about God onto the world. He was asking those of us who believe in God, which is most of us most of the time, what God is it? Or what God it is we believe in? Good question. So I want to just take 30 seconds, and I want you to remember what I read to you out of Luke 15 and reflect on that a second or two. And think about how would you answer the question if you and I were having coffee and I said, what do you think? It's like the core of God, the core characteristics of God. A second core initiative that our elder board and staff committed ourselves to As you heard a little bit already in the service, in light of the death of George Floyd, in the light of coming to terms with the history in our country and present expressions of racism, we wanted to be a church in the heart of a great American city who was working for justice and for healing. I am sure some of you in this church this morning believe that a core description of God's character is a God of justice who seeks healing for broken lives. I would say you're probably right. Again, afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to engage, sign up if you want to do some work with this great group of people that is working on it. I'm proud to be a part of a church who is wanting to do that work. Another one of those initiatives, in light of a transition staff-wise between Kyle leaving as youth pastor, we wanted to invest in our youth, in our children. I want you to know that over the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, we have spent $125,000 as a church remodeling the spaces so that our young people would have great spaces to get together and engage in spiritual truths so that they could make decisions for themselves. I'm proud of the youth staff that we have had over the years. There's so many of you that have volunteered and participated. One of those initiatives was to refine Kyle's replacement, and we have. Adrian Chambers, whom some of you or most of you have met, has been hired. He'll be a great addition to this church, and we hope that he will be a part of it for many, many years. So those are 3 of the initiatives. A 4th initiative was, I spoke to the elder board that I've been here a long time, and we need to begin the process of thinking about Calvary post Calmeadows, and that's a process that we met with the executive director of American Baptist Churches out of Des Moines. She gave us some great advice. Our plan moving forward basically is there's no timetable right now, but she encouraged us to really build infrastructure within our church, meaning get your elder board really solid, celebrate your deacons, and make sure that the systems and how decisions are made and the way things work in this church are really solid, so that it's all in place for the next person. And so there'll be an opportunity for you, again, in these initiatives to ask, am I right to be on the elder board of our church? Do I want to be a deacon? Can I help prepare this church, strengthen the muscle and the bones and the tissue of Calvary Church? I hope you will think about that. Now back to Luke 15. In the parable of, here's what I'm going to read to you a second. In my English Bible, it says the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the prodigal and his brother. Can you flip the slide, and I'll try to make my point here. Titles start the process of interpretation. We read the Bible, we read it in English, of course. And so somebody somewhere along the line, not sure who, decided that this was going to be called the prodigal of the lost sheep. Somebody, some group decided, because it's not there. You understand, these titles are not in the original text. There are no titles. Somebody decided that the second one would be called the parable of the lost coin. And that the third one would be called the parable of the prodigal. What? Prodigal and his brother, even though the word prodigal is nowhere to be found in the story. Right, Dan? Let me ask you a question. Is the parable of the lost sheep about the sheep or about the shepherd? Could it be called the parable of the shepherd who goes in search of the lost sheep? If that was the title, it would make it clear this is about God. Let me ask you another question. What does the sheep do to be found? I've told you this over and over and over again. God chose you before you chose God. The parable of the lost coin. Could it be entitled the parable of God as a woman who goes in search of something incredibly valuable to her? That's what I would call it. Maybe we wouldn't have had to deal with images of God as an old white dude with a beard in heaven all these years if we had titled that parable as that. Titles start the process of interpretation. What does the coin do to be found? I told you this over and over again. It was God who came in search of you before you went in search of God. The sheep was valuable to the shepherd. The coin was valuable to the woman. You and I are valuable to God. And at the core of God's character is the embrace of your value. So much so that according to the parable, God does whatever it takes. I mentioned to you the third one, the parable of the prodigal. It's a very special one to Randy and I. Prodigal Pub was one of the fifth of our initiatives. Strategic initiatives as a church was to find a way. How can we create a partnership between a pub of all things in the neighborhood that is engaging people who aren't coming to church? How can we partner as a pub and as a church so that we can somehow create a sacred space there for people? Some of whom may come over here and find this sacred community. And how could we take some of this sacred community, meaning you, and come to the space of the pub and interface and build relationships naturally with people who are neighbors who aren't coming to Calvary. So that's why the fifth initiative was really something that was extremely important to me, because Randy and I have given so much to the creation of this pub. One of the realizations after 2.5 years is, you know what? There are lost people who come into that pub. And I don't mean that as a value judgment or as a statement about their eternal destiny. I'm not making that. I'm not What I'm saying is, let me phrase it another way. I don't, they find the pub as their home. And on one hand, that's okay. But come on, there has to be something bigger in the world to find home than a pub. The pub is just a tool. But I can tell you, we have a lot of lonely neighbors. And the prodigal, you know what the word prodigal means? Yeah, Randy does. Look at that. Y'all read that? Wastefully or recklessly extravagant. Tell me what the prodigal story is about. Who is reckless and lavish in their extravagance? The Father is. Why isn't it called the parable of the prodigal father who's been looking for his lost son ever since he left, waiting, and then when he sees him, he runs down the road against every cultural norm of his time. He gives him the best robe, he gives him the ring, he puts sandals on his feet, he kills the fatted calf, and each of these parables, there is an extravagant, lavishly community party that is thrown. It's the core character of God. There it is. It's in all three. Yes. Lost, found. When I made a decision, that was the beginning of my discipleship journey. Of working out, fleshing out, building upon, growing, developing what it means to be found. Yes, dead and alive. You see it. I don't have to describe what death looks like out there. It's also in here. I know what it feels like. Yes, estranged, separated, conflict. Yes. It's in here. It's in here. It's in the racial discussions we're having. It's between men and women. I played golf yesterday with a guy who got into a fight the night before at a bar because he was talking to two Latinos. This is in Brainerd, Minnesota. His ethnic background is Ecuadorian. His father was Ecuadorian, his mother was Anglo-American. And so he's very Latino looking. He's talking to these guys, having a good time. And then he notices two Latino brothers, so he goes over and talks to them. This guy is an extrovert, like big time, right? One of the guys in the white group came over to him and said, "Hey, I thought you were one of us," which proceeded into a conversation that led to the parking lot and this guy punching the guy. So this estrangement is real, and so is the work of embracing. That's what we're called to do, right? And here it is. This is a quote. Truly, madly, deeply, in each of these parables, does the God figure love. Deeply, madly, truly. That, brothers and sisters, is the character of God. That's what I want you to decide on. The theological debate in Arizona was, Everyone must decide, and if you don't decide, you go to hell. And I'm leaving the Vikings loss. I mean, I'm in hell at the point, right about then, feeling like it anyway. Again, been there many times. And my friend's wife said, Jeff, there is a hell. And I said to myself, and I didn't really get into this much with her, I know there's hell described for the devil and his angels. Fine. Let's get this first. Let's get this right first, okay? And then we can debate some of these other issues. Let's get this first. Who is God? God is the creator who loves deeply, truly, and madly, and who will do whatever it takes to find the one. And the one is you and your neighbor and every single person that walks into that pub. God bless you guys. Amen.